Welcome, class, back to History 103. We'll come in here for the final primary source assignment introduction video that will also serve as sort of a wrap-up to the course. And we're touching on some of my favorite, really, in the entire course, this is the stuff that is just the most utterly fascinating to me. This question when you get into the 14th, 15th, and into the 16th century, this question of crisis, but also creativity. So I'm really excited to be talking with you all about this, and we're looking forward to reading your responses. And who knows, you may get, hint, a lot of information about the final assignment. So maybe you should pay attention to everything. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this course. As some of you know from emails that I've sent out, my research interests are in the 16th and 17th century, so a little bit past the medieval period as it's traditionally thought of, and certainly past what we're going to cover in this course. But medieval history is what originally took me and what originally set me on this path of becoming a historian. So for me, it's been a lot of fun to teach this class. When I was taking this class, it's what really got me into history. So I just want to thank you all for taking the course and completing the assignments and sticking it through with me, because it's been really a pleasure for me. But you're not here for me to wax poetic, that's certainly for sure. So yes, like I said, we're in this time period where we have crisis and creativity, and that's really the main question for the primary source. But first, I want to kind of lecture a little bit, not a long lecture, but just give you some information about the Black Death, because for me it is one of the most utterly fascinating, transformative events. I like to say I love the Black Death. I don't love that it killed so many people. 50 to 60% of all Europe died because of the plague. I don't love that, but how people interacted with it, how people tried to cope with what happened, how civilization picked back the pieces back up. That's what I love so much about this time period. So let's get to it. So one sort of hangover, which I think is very important to this story of the Black Death, because this time we're talking about this as a crisis. We have to remember this is a deeply Christian world. This is where everyone that we're reading about in this textbook, unless the Byzantines are Christian, but obviously the Islamic parts are not Christian. But the Christians, they're all deeply tied to this. This isn't a time period when atheism was possible. Non-religious belief really wasn't what people did. The way society was constructed, you didn't question whether God existed and whether God had an active hand in affairs. So as we discuss these catastrophes going forward, keep in mind that everyone, whether they were kings, whether they were people, the townspeople, whether they were peasants, were wondering what they had done, what had been done to deserve this punishment. So yeah, and keep in mind this is religious. People also thought in terms of the end of the apocalypse. This was the end of the world for people. And apocalyptic thought is terribly fascinating to me. But sort of the best way I think to think about this is in terms of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which you've all probably heard about before in the past. But really we can break them down into here as being famine, war, plague, and death. So we're going to go through the four there, and we'll sort of get about this apocalyptic end of the world that's going on, because this is the end of our course. So it's sort of only appropriate that we're talking about the end of the world, because what could exist beyond the History 103? So with famine, we talked at the end of the last chapter, chapter 7, about the Great Famine, which happened between 1315 and 1317. Of course, we learned that it was exacerbated by foraging armies. Where there were foraging armies going through. If there wasn't a war, then you didn't really have to worry about the roving bands of men coming through to steal your harvests, to run, have a battle in your fields, which would destroy the crops. And it wasn't even just enemy troops that did this, it would be your own friendly troops, because for them it was an opportunity to feed themselves. They weren't very well paid, and they needed to eat. And unlike you, poor peasant, who also needed to eat, they had swords. So yeah, they kind of came out on top on that situation. Now the Great Famine in 1315, 17 is also caused by weather, wet summers, which didn't really allow the crops to grow as well. You had cold winters, which exacerbated the problem. And around 10% of Europe died during the Great Famine. So, a lot of people. If I were in the classroom, I would say, that there's around 40 of you in the class, so 4 of you stand up and get out your dead. But this is 10%, but it's not anywhere near the numbers we're going to see as we move forward. There was another famine that took place in 1437 and 1438. This was caused more by weather, again, the same problem of too much rain, cold winter. But famine was an ever-present problem. These were agricultural societies, they were subsistence farmers, that in a lot of cases, they were just sort of, paying their bills in terms of eating enough and then hoping the next harvest would get them through. So when you had a bad harvest, there was a lot of problems. So hunger, ever-present thing, and of course hunger weakens people, which becomes important when we get to the plague discussion. Then we move into war. We discussed war a little bit already, but this is a time period at the end of the medieval period where war goes through some serious developments. You get developments in technology, and you get some developments in strategy that drastically change the way war is conducted. For instance, you have infantry that for the first time in a very long time becomes superior to cavalry. That is, men on the ground with spikes can keep away the men on horses that are running at you. And this changes the battlefield drastically because with infantry you need more men. And to have more men, you need more government bureaucracy to keep track of things. You need to pay more taxes. You need to collect more taxes to pay for these troops, which means, basically government gets bigger and bigger because they have to pay for these ever-growing armies. And because when you're fighting an army, if your enemy has more men in his army, you have to get more. So it's sort of this, if you think about rotating, getting closer and closer towards this goal of having centralized monarchy in Europe. Obviously there are limits in terms of how centralized things are, but when you look at the beginning of the period versus the end, there's this fantastic quote here. In 1300, political discourse focused on liberties and restricting the sprawl of government. By 1460, 100 years later, however, there was a marked acceptance of government and an emphasis instead upon common good. So people stopped talking about whether government was a good or a bad thing. They all just, by the end, agreed that government was good, and it was a question about how to best implement government. Governments emerged from the 14th and 15th centuries with stronger centers, more complex administrations, and clearer boundaries. The debates toward the end of the period focused on the effectiveness of government, not its existence. This political growth and the acceptance of the newly crystallized states demonstrate that the 15th century was not a time of crisis in this scholar's mind. Although, as we'll see, there are some things that make it maybe a little more complicated or not. That's a discussion that you may have a chance to answer when it comes to the final exam. Who knows? Now, of course, with having bigger government, having more taxes to pay for these bigger armies, one other thing goes along with that. People don't like to be taxed. This is as true as it is today as it was in the past. So you had big revolts, big peasant revolts. There's, in France, the famous one is the Jacquerie, or Jacquerie, I suppose. Make it easier if you don't know what's going on. And then, of course, the big one, the famous one, is the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. And the end result of this is that the revolts were put down, but because there was this threat of violence, then the seigneurial lords ended up making some concessions towards the people. Now, why were the peasants suddenly rising up when they weren't in the past? Well, there was a labor shortage. And why was there a labor shortage? Because everyone had just pretty much died. So let's get into sort of the main star here today, the Black Plague. Which was actually, the Black Death was not called the Black Death in the medieval period. That's not what they called it. They called it either the pestilence, the plague, or the great mortality. It was such a big event that you didn't have to qualify it by calling it, the plague of whatever. It was just the plague, and everyone knew what you were talking about. Get into some numbers here. The book says 50% dead, and there's some debate over the amount of people that died. Some of the more convincing recent scholarship is saying that we should actually revise those figures a little higher, because we get our figures from written sources, and these are men that are educated, and these are not the people that are dying en masse in the countryside. So because of this fault of sources, this lack of sources in the countryside for who's dying and who's living, we're thinking we need to sort of bump that number up to around 60%. And think, 60% of people dying, or 50%, whatever number you want to pick. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of people to die in such a short amount of time, because the first wave of the plague sort of shows up in Messina in southern Italy in 1347, and kind of peters itself out by 1352 when it gets to Russia, and it spreads like a wildfire through. And of course, it's variable as well. There's certain little mountain towns in the Alps or in the Vosges or wherever, or places that were secluded that did not really get hit by the plague. They didn't really experience it at all. Or there's places that only got hit by, maybe 20% of the people died. Only a fifth of the population dies. But that means, law of averages, this is Purdue, kind of renowned for being good at math and engineering and such. If you have areas that have fewer people dying than the average, it means there are areas with more. So there are some areas where 70 to 80% of the population died in the space of a year, a couple months. And just think what that does to a society when you lose that many people. It's astounding. And it was made worse. You had also in sort of getting into professional levels, because what are people going to do when this happens? Who do they seek help from? Well, they go to medical professionals. Of course, medicine at the time wasn't advanced enough to really know about germ theory and what was going on. So you ended up having a lot of people just blaming the doctors because they couldn't save their child or their sister or their cousin or their mother or what have you. So you also had people, the physicians who, when you have to pay for them to come by and they don't fix things, then you just accuse them of greed, of showing up and doing nothing and then getting out of there. And then worst of all, you have physicians that just say, I'm not coming, because this is a disease that shows up, and as soon as it shows up, people are dead within a matter of 48, 72 hours. I mean, it's rapid, and it just comes in like a thunderbolt. And what happens is the way they know it. It's why we call it the bubonic plague. Sometimes you get these buboes, these like sores that are about the size of a fist and start pulling up over your body, and the reek of pus and smell of death just all throughout the air. It's disgusting stuff. So all right, the medicine isn't working. So what do we do? This is a very Christian society. Well, let's talk to the priest. Well, a lot of priests do take their duties very seriously, so they wouldn't help these people. And as you know, when you hang out with sick people, you get sick. So we see tremendous mortality in the rate of the priesthood. Between 40 and 65%, depending on your location, of priests just drop down and die. It leads to a real problem once the plague is over, because now you don't have a priest. And for a religion such as Christianity in the Middle Ages, when it's very top down, when you have doctrines that are decided at councils and popes, and they send them down to bishops who then send them down to parish priests, when you start losing links in the chain, it becomes complicated and a problem, and people don't have their priest that can run through the ceremonies. You also get the problem of priests who see what's happening in terms of disease, and they get the hell out of town. They decide this isn't worth it. I mean, people are dropping dead. They're in fear for their lives, and as sincere as their thought may or may not have been. People get scared, and they run. So you have this sort of dual problem of the good priests are dead, and the priests that ran are discredited. So it relates to some real religious tensions that we'll discuss as we get further on into this little video. To go into sort of the timing, it arrives in Messina in 1347. There's a fantastic passage. It so happened that in the month of October, in the year of our Lord 1347, around the first of that month, 12 Genoese galleys, fleeing from our Lord's wrath, which came down upon them for their misdeeds. It's very important to remember, this is viewed through the sense of, you did a bad thing, you get punished by God, because God takes an active role in everything. Fleeing our Lord's wrath, which came down upon them for their misdeeds, put in at the port city of Messina. They brought with them a plague that they carried down to the very marrow of their bones, so that if anyone so much as spoke to them, he was infected with a mortal sickness, which brought on an immediate death that he could in no way avoid. I mean, it's so powerful to listen to these primary sources that discuss what's happening. And I'm really excited you'll get a chance to read Boccaccio's Decameron, because it'll really give you a sense of this. Another primary source said, this is from Agnolo di Tura of Siena, again in Italy. So many have died that everyone believes it is the end of the world. Another monk wrote, the living were hardly able to bury the dead. There were so many. And the thing to keep in mind with this plague, we talk about how it started in 47, obviously October 47 in Messina, and by 52 it's run its course through Russia. It didn't just come once. Every 7, 8 years, another bout of plague would come again, and it would never be as deadly as it was the first time. It would never kill another 50, 60% of the population. But each time it would take more, and it would make more and more and more. It became something that people began to just live with and accept. By 1420, on a Europe-wide scale, there were only about a third of the people left. So if you, I mean, just imagine this is 1420, this is 70 years after this whole madness starts. And you have only a third of the European population left. Because usually demographically populations grow over time. But what happened is it just caused such a great loss, and you continue to lose people, that we were down to a third of the people living in Europe. And as before, this is a variable rate. Particularly if you look in Normandy, which was particularly hard hit throughout all of this because it was a big trading area. You had, say if you had 100 people that lived in Normandy, you had more than that, but if you had 100 people that lived in Normandy in 1347 before the plague hits, by 1430, there are only 15 left. 85%. Think of all the houses where people used to live, the fields that are abandoned. It creates a tremendous problem in society, because how do people cope with this? And you see this in the artistic expressions. You see people allegorically, they're writing about or painting pictures of normal people having conversations with death. That's how they cope with it. Or you see this danse macabre, this dance of death, where people would go and dance. And it was a way of welcoming, in a way, it was accepting that death was a part of their life. You see this idea of the vado mori, which is Latin for I go to die. There's this increasing acceptance that death is a part of your life. Or the ars moriendi, the art of dying, where there becomes sort of rules about what is the best way to die, what is an honorable way to go out onto this next earth. You also see allegorical depictions of death change. Death, which before was regarded as this kind of sister, which helped move you on from your temporal life into your eternal life. It moves on, it no longer has this sister aspect, this almost, familial, welcome, accepted part of life. It turns into this devouring monster that wipes through everyone. On the other hand, death rites begin to be ignored. You have people who, before you would put them in shrouds and have chants and do whatever you would do. They don't do that anymore. There's just too many dead people. And the other thing is, people are afraid of the dead bodies, they see the sickness, so they hide. So you see less and less individual burials and more just mass burials where people throw bodies into pits. And of course, the people making the most money from this were the grave diggers, because they were, we talk about hazard pay. In the modern day, they got some pretty big hazard pay, because you had to pay people that much to be able to be willing to move these bodies. Because even family members were abandoning, as I believe it talks about on the Decameron, where you have people who, they see that their wife has come down with sickness and they abandon her for fear of life. They grab the children and run because they figure she's dead. I better try and save what I can. So you have familial ties breaking apart. And, it's not just the priests and the physicians that are running, it's the very family members. The very building blocks of society are separating and coming apart. No wonder people thought of this as the end of the world, of an apocalypse. You also see some administrative responses in the towns. You have towns that begin to shut the gates. They just say, no more foreigners, no more, because they had this idea that the disease traveled with new people coming in and bringing it. They were smart enough to know that. So they would just shut the gates to everyone and quarantine everyone away. In fact, that's where the word quarantine comes from. If any of you have any training in any Romance languages, quarante is French, or quarante in Italian. That means 40, because there's this idea that when ships arrived in a new port, they were kept away from everyone for 40 days to make sure there was no plague. Whatever diseases and plague was on there would burn itself out. As well, there was a religious reaction. Religion became more personal. Remember, we just had a lot of priests die. The priests that were good and that getting disease and dying. The priests that ran away, well, people didn't really trust them. So religion becomes a lot more personal. And you see this growing distinction between the body, which is the temporal stuff, the human body, and then you have the spiritual, eternal soul. And this growing distinction, because there's this idea that, yes, we may die because of plague at any moment, but the eternal soul lives on. And this fits in perfectly well with the renewal of lay religiosity we discussed in the last chapter. Of course, there were moments of just abject hysteria. One of the more famous examples are the flagellants. These were the people that would wear coarse hair shirts and walk through the towns. They would have these whips and they would be slapping their backs as they're going through singing religious songs and talking about their sins and confessing their sins out in the open as almost as a way to say, no need to punish me with the plague. I'm being a good Christian. I'm fessing up to my ills. And of course, as has sadly been a theme in this course, there was violence against the Jews, because the Jews, as we discussed in the past, were viewed as an outside people. They were viewed as the killers of Jesus. And in this particular instance, they thought that it was Jews that were poisoning wells. So there were pogroms and violence that was organized against Jews. In addition to the plague and dealing with death in general, this is also a time of tremendous political upheaval. And continuing with this religious theme, of course, there's the papacy, and you read in the book about how the papacy had moved to Avignon for a couple centuries, or a couple decades, and then tried to move back to Rome, but there was a dispute, and then you ended up having two popes that were mutually excommunicating one another. And it's really, it's hard to overstate what a crisis this was for people, because the pope was viewed as God's representative on earth. He was called the Vicar of Christ, the representative of Jesus Christ. So when you have two of them that are there saying, I'm the real one, the other guy's bad, how do you pick? How do you decide? And if you choose wrongly, well, it's only the eternal salvation of your soul at stake. So this was a tremendous crisis for people, and it was really hard. And it finally ended up getting solved by what's called conciliarism. Conciliarism being councils. And a council was gathered, and they decided to elect a third pope, who then excommunicated the other two. In turn, the other two popes excommunicated him, naturally. But they eventually did, after a couple rounds of this, figure out one pope and go back to that. And this leads in general to a crisis in confidence. I mean, people have this world, and it's been turned upside down. Society's falling apart. You've lost 50 to 60% of the population. Some areas harder hit, some areas less hard hit. You have priests that are running away. People are losing confidence in the basic structures of everyday life. You have popes excommunicating one another. And even, we've talked about how the government becomes stronger during this time period, a lot of it because of increased bureaucracy, increased need for taxation to pay for the wars. But, one of the problems when you say that I'm here because God has put me on this earth is when things go wrong and people think that it's divine punishment. Well, you're kind of stuck because you're on the hook for that, even though the king really, it's like the king was ordering the plague. People blame the king for the plague and figure, oh, well, he must be a sinner as well, such that his entire kingdom would be punished. And of course, this adds into this atmosphere that comes later of peasant revolts. Of course, the peasants' revolt, as we talked, mostly for taxation reasons, but also there was this crisis of confidence that came out of this terrible experience. And finally, to top it all off, we have the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire has been with us since the beginning of the course. We talked about it as one of the three heirs of Rome. But in 1453, they're conquered by the Turks. And Byzantium doesn't exist anymore. And then it's like, well, geez, we've just lost Rome. We've just lost one of the, the last remnant of Rome. And even though the West had a complicated relationship with Constantinople, as we saw during the Fourth Crusade, when Latin crusaders sacked Constantinople, it still was a tremendous psychological shock for the people living in Europe in 1453. So it's really, this is a time for a lot of people where it feels like it's the apocalypse. It feels like it's the end of the world. But it should be kept in mind that in apocalyptic medieval theology, it implied a new beginning. The idea was that apocalypse would wipe everything out and then would start again. And in many ways, we've talked about how this is a time of crisis and creativity. It's this apocalypse that paves the way, in a sense, for this new era of creativity. So let's discuss that a little bit, because it's one of the paradoxes of this time where everything seems so dark, but it's also the beginning of some of the most tremendously expansive, creative, wondrous things that have been done in European history. So, you have this idea, the silver lining thesis that comes directly out of the Black Death. The silver lining, of course, every cloud has a silver lining. And one of it goes back to this idea that a gentleman named Malthus proposed. And it says basically that there's a limited number of people that a given amount of land can support. It's sort of, if you think about on a lower scale, you have a farm, and you can feed, say, your family off the farm. But if you keep having children, you're not going to have enough farmland, and then people starve. And there's like a natural cap in terms of what people can support. Well, the neo-Malthusian thesis here because Malthus said it's not the whole world as a whole. One of the keys that comes out of this is that because so many people die, that means a lot of labor is freed up, a lot of land is freed up that formerly was being used for farming, now can be used for other things. And then because you have fewer people that can work, that means you have to come up with technological innovations to save labor that allows more people, once those populations recover, you don't need as many people to farm, they can move on and do other things. You also have, because people have to get paid more for their labor, people have more money, which means more money can be invested into the economy. So there's really, there is, in one sense, there's the silver lining theory. Of course, we talked as well about the religious and cultural renovation that goes through, and people take religion a little bit more personally in different ways. So there definitely is this element to this silver lining of, yes, the Black Death is terrible. We lost 50 to 60% of the population in Europe, but it led to some consequences that overall were beneficial. Of course, I should say that not every technological bit of progress that came out of this time period was due to the Black Death. The biggest one, sort of the number one was the printing press, which dramatically changed European society in a way that, it hasn't probably been changed since the advent of the internet. Up until today. I mean, it was that big of a thing where people went from books were something that monks spent painstaking months creating to books could be printed much more rapidly and could be diffused much more widely. So that wasn't really at all due to the technological impetus after the Black Death, but it was a big technological advance. You also get technological advances that allow people to explore further in ships. You get different types of compasses, you get different types of sails. And it allows people to go a little further, and we'll talk about some of the consequences that come out of that a little bit further on. Of course, one of this, we're talking about the printing presses, we have to talk about religious revival, because, as we said, religion is getting more personal. People are questioning the existing system, and you get some people, such as John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, who are starting to say some things that upset people in the church. And at the Council of Constance in 1415, Jan Hus, who was a Bohemian preacher from the area around Prague in the Czech Republic, he was declared a heretic and burnt at the stake. And Jan Wycliffe, who by that point was dead, but he was declared a heretic, his writings were declared no longer valid, and his body was dug up and then burned, and his ashes were thrown into the river. That was what was done with heretics. You burned heretics. But they lived. But, 1415, add another 100 years, in 1515, there's a monk by the name of Martin Luther that has some other ideas that in many ways borrow from what Wycliffe and Jan Hus were saying. And he doesn't get burnt because he's protected by his Lord. And then you get the Reformation start. Martin Luther, he doesn't burn. John Calvin, he doesn't burn. And the Reformation really isn't part of what this class is supposed to do. But at the same time, keep in mind, this is what's coming. This is what's coming down the pipe. And the printing press helps that massively because it allows them to get their message out in a further, more widely diffused way. Of course, the big creative flowering that comes out of this is the Renaissance. It wasn't just in Italy, it was where it was centered and it was where it grew out of. But Italy was, the Renaissance took place in France, the Renaissance took place in Northern Europe, especially with Christian humanism. And your book talks about this in more detail. But the Renaissance is a huge bit of the creativity here, and it's really the start of where this book, Hatcher's Decameron, that you'll be looking at this week, comes out of. One thing to mention about the Renaissance that's important is that it's about returning to the past. Remember, we had the question on the midterm that was, is this a dark age? Well, the idea of dark age comes out of the Renaissance, when these people are going back to the Greek and Latin times. They're trying to, in a way, resurrect the cultural glories of the Roman Empire. And it's interesting to think about different types of trying to redo the empire, because people have been trying to redo the Roman Empire for a lot of this course. Charlemagne declared himself Roman Empire, or the Pope declared him, but he was probably quite happy to receive it. You had attempts to reform Rome with the Holy Roman Empire that came later in Germany. You had attempts to reform sort of Roman authority in the way that people would structure their government. They based their law on Roman things. So Rome is something that's been with us this entire course. And that's something you may want to pay attention to, because it might be something that shows up on the final exam. Maybe. Wink, wink. So this question of Rome is very important. And that's what people are trying to do in the Renaissance, is they're trying to go back to Rome. They're trying to bring back the cultural knowledge, and they view it as a superior time. And that's why the Middle Ages is what's called the Dark Ages. It is because it's a dark age, because they're not looking into Roman learning. Even though they're being kind of foolish about it, because none of the Roman sources that they're studying would have existed if it wasn't for the monks in the Middle Ages that were saving them and preserving them. And of course, one of the big things that radically changes things is the discovery of the New World. You have Columbus showing up, then Cortez conquers the Aztecs. You have the fall of the Incan Empire. This whole new world opens up, and people are like, what is going on over here? There's a whole other continent with all their civilizations and empires. How to react to this? They're not Christian, but they have these massive, the size of the pyramids that they found in Mexico were tremendous, and they're just trying to wrap their heads around how this could work. It's an entirely new world. And of course, the way they approach this is very much in terms of a crusade. We talked about crusades in the past, of course, but there's a decent argument to be made that the conquistadors saw their chance to go into Mexico as a crusade, because they were saving souls. And of course, the way people thought about it at the time was that we're not committing violence, we're not doing a bad thing, but by declaring a crusade, we're doing a good thing, because we're saving people's souls from eternal damnation and bringing them into the light. So in a way, even though tolerance is a very good thing today, it's something that we all uphold as something that should be celebrated. In the past, tolerance was a bad thing, because tolerance was letting evilness exist inside of your community. So religion is very important for this discovery of the New World, because the Spanish conquistadors see it as their mission to go and civilize these territories and bring Christianity to them. And of course, they have very economic motivations for going as well, as there usually is in most things in history. The reason the explorations even happened was because with the fall of the Byzantine Empire, no longer could they trade through Constantinople. So European traders, since that route to the east was blocked, they had to circle to the west. And they originally tried to go around Africa, and then they eventually decided, Columbus said, I think the world, it's round, and I'll go around it. Now, of course, it should be mentioned that everyone knew the world was round at that point. There was none of this, the world's flat business. The thing was, they just didn't think North America existed. And Columbus made a mistake in his calculations, where he thought the world was about a third smaller than what it was. So he figured, oh yeah, I'll be able to sail around and get to India, in 30, 40 days, and it'll be great. Just so happened that in 30 or 40 days he showed up in North America, in the Caribbean, so it worked out for him in terms of not being stuck in the middle of the ocean. But he totally miscalculated that. So yes, it should absolutely be made clear that they did not think the world was flat. But yeah, I'm trying to catch up here so we don't run out of battery again. But essentially this is a new dawn. We talked about how this was an apocalypse, but the apocalypse gives birth to a new world. So it's a time period. This chapter is particularly interesting to me, because it's both a time period of crisis, but a time period of creativity. And that might be a good thing to think about when it comes time to do the final exam. And of course, getting specifically onto your primary source assignment, I uploaded to the site sort of little blurb about Boccaccio and the Decameron that should give you the material that you need to answer the data section. Please, 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 please do not enter the text that's, it's from this book that was published in, let me see, what I don't want you to do is say that, because at the bottom it has, this is translated from the Italian by Richard Hooker in 1993. Don't put that. I know this is from anything. I'm interested in the information that's relevant to Boccaccio, who lived during the time of the Black Death. So please do pay attention to read that. It's just a paragraph that I put up there. The question is, Boccaccio's Decameron represents both facets of this chapter, that of catastrophe and that of creativity. It describes the horrid experience of the Black Death, but also the document itself, written in vernacular Florentine Italian and not Latin, is indicative of the intellectual flowering that took place in Italy during the 14th and especially 15th centuries. The Black Death was a horrific experience which saw half the population of Europe killed and deeply affected European society. How does the document demonstrate the ways in which cultural norms were abandoned or changed? That's the first question you should make sure you answer. How did people react to the plague? That's the second question you should make sure you answer. And how would you have reacted? Obviously there's no correct answer to how you would have reacted, but it's just a way to put yourself into the shoes there and think about what it would be like to have 50% of the people drop dead around you. Not quite as quick as Thanos, but really quick in general. It only took a couple days. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your responses. I've been very happy with how the primary source assignments have gone. I've really enjoyed the course. And I just wanted to thank you all again. And I hope you have a good week. And I'm always open to answer any of your questions. I can do Skype, I can do email, I can do whatever is happy and good to help you succeed. Thank you so much.